Hello, and welcome to A Healthy Mind. I'm Dr. Cislina Grosser-Ledbetter, Director of Counseling and Student Development at the University of the District of Columbia, and your host. On today's edition, our issue is the forgiveness of self and others, and in the context of addictions. My guest is Dr. Michael Scherer. Dr. Scherer completed a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling and holds a doctoral degree in counseling psychology. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Drug Dependence and Epidemiology Training Program. Woo! His research revolves around several areas to include forgiveness of self and of others as a coping strategy, substance use and misuse, and other high-risk behaviors. He is particularly interested in how the role of social networks, cognitive abilities, and personality factors influence risk-taking behavior. But our focus will be on forgiveness of self and of others as a coping strategy. Welcome, Dr. Scherer.
Thank you.
Yeah, so talk to us about what you do. So you've done some counseling, and you've also done some probably, analysis, and now you are doing research. So talk a little bit about what you're doing there in Hopkins.
I have, I would say, two main avenues of research, both of them revolving around substance use to some extent. First is I look at what individual characteristics contribute to using and abusing substances. And second, I look at what I like to call innovative ways of treating substance use disorders.
So what have you found? Why do people use?
There's a huge range of possible answers to a question like that.
Right. No, you're going to give us the answer.
Oh, okay. The reason I look at most, I would say, is substance use as a coping strategy. I mean, on a very fundamental level, it's a very effective, if unhealthy, way of coping.
Effective?
Well, I feel bad, I drink, I feel better. It's obviously not something you want people to do. It's unhealthy, it's bad for you, and so on. But it works, and that's why people keep doing it. It doesn't solve any problems. So when they sober up or whatever the problems, of course, are still there, and they still have a need to cope with them.
But at least for the meantime, and so you're not suggesting that people do the drinking and drugging. You're simply saying that it actually makes the feeling of whatever it is that's not palatable while they're sober.
Right.
Go away.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd never, of course, advocate.
No, I know. Just making sure that we got that clear.
Right.
And so we were also talking about the types of substance abuse you see. You're in Baltimore, and I was kind of shocked to hear that there's still a lot of heroin use. I would think crack or cocaine, but you're seeing.
There certainly is a lot of crack and cocaine use, and we see a lot of substances other than heroin, but the major focal point, at least of a lot of my research and alarming statistics for Baltimore, are that the heroin use is still very high. I mean, it's gotten better, in recent years, of course, but it's still higher.
And it's high, but is drug abuse, and this is like a huge question, but is it stabilizing? Is it going up? Are they just switching drugs? What's happening and what is the research telling us?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, mostly because a lot of research measures substance use in different ways. Like some people self-report using substances. Sometimes we take their blood. Sometimes we take oral fluid samples. Sometimes we measure behaviors. There's all kinds of ways to do that. Generally, I can't say definitely, but it does seem maybe there's some trends to decreasing the amount of heroin use. It's just not decreasing fast enough.
It's not fast enough,
right.
Yeah. So how do you get your population? So are you seeing people through therapists that have practice, and then you're doing your study? Are you doing study just purely based on data and self-report? How are you actually doing your work?
Well, the participants in our research are mostly referred from community mental health facilities or by word of mouth or by street recruitment, those kinds of things.
And what are you looking for?
Well, basically, we're trying to gain a firm understanding of how rampant or how many people are actually using these substances, why they're using it, who's using it, where are points that we can intervene to stop the use or at least make it less harmful.
Yeah, and are you finding, how can we intervene?
Well, there's several possible avenues. A lot of that is people don't go to treatment because there's a certain negative perception associated with going to treatment.
They go because they're broken, right? They
Right.
go because they're sick. They go because they need help. And
Exactly.
right.
And with addictions especially, I think what we find is, though some people are mandated by judges to go to treatment,
Right.
but most people that go are mandated somehow, whether it be a
I see.
wife or a husband that says you better go to treatment, or a friend that says, man, you got to get help. Or
So most of your clients are not coming in because they're like, okay, I have a problem, I need to come in for treatment. It's because they're mandated in some way.
Right.
Okay. So talk a little bit about forgiveness, because you've developed a concept that links strongly forgiveness with treatment.
Yeah, that's right. When I worked at a community mental health center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a few years back, and there we worked with a lot of people who dealt with alcohol abuse. Was primarily the clientele we worked with there. And as I was working with them individually, I tended to notice a lot of patterns of people feeling a lot of shame and feeling a lot of guilt for the kinds of things they did while under the influence of alcohol, or maybe the responsibilities that they didn't meet because of alcohol, or letting down family members and so on.
Now, these are alcoholics or just alcohol abusers? And there's a distinction, right?
There is, absolutely.
Okay.
These are people that I would say just misused
alcohol. Tell us what the distinction is. I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of time there, but just tell us a little bit of the difference.
So people who continuously misuse any substance, in this case alcohol, are just using that substance to the point where they can't meet some personal responsibility. They're letting down family members, they're not going to work, they're not going to classes,
right,
those kinds of things.
Which is different from alcoholism.
Right.
Because alcoholism is the actual chemical
exactly
dependence.
Right. It's just, and it's much more pervasive through really every aspect of their lives. And though I worked with both, most people are simply people that struggle with alcohol misuse.
Okay.
Right.
And then, so how did that kind of lead you into developing your method of integrating forgiveness?
Well, like I said, there was a lot of shame and guilt with this population, and in standard addiction treatment, or in standard alcohol groups, they tend to just say, stop using is bad, and they take away that coping strategy, an unhealthy coping strategy again, but they take it away, and they don't necessarily replace it with something.
So are you referring to like 12-step? I don't know. So when you say they just say stop it?
Well, there's two types of schools of thought when you have an addiction, right? There's in order for someone to get better, they have to stop drinking entirely or stop using entirely. Other people say, well, you can scale down the use less and less and less to make it, just using alcohol instead of misusing it, right? So they're still drinking, but they're not failing their obligations or what have you.
And based on your research, does it matter which one, complete abstinence, or I can take a drink every once in a while as long as I do it responsibly? Because you're right, there are two schools of thoughts.
Right.
But based on the research, which one, is there one that's better than the other? Which causes?
There isn't really one that's really better than the other, I would say. People who misuse alcohol can cut back on their drinking, but people who are alcoholics or who are dependent or abuse alcohol, that's really not an option. They can't even necessarily go into a bar where there is alcohol and have a hamburger and water.
Really?
You can't really expose them to those possibilities because it's a chemical reaction rather than a coping strategy.
Does it ever go away?
For the alcoholics, or?
For the alcoholics.
No, well,
It doesn't.
I don't
Are you
know.
always an alcoholic? I mean, because you get in these circles and they say you're always an alcoholic, you're a recovering alcoholic, and I recognize there's schools of thoughts about that too. But I wonder, based on your research and what you know about it, does that drive to drink, that chemical dependency, ever go away? Like people that quit smoking, for example, they actually say, a lot of them say they lose the urge.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to smoke anymore.
Right.
It's nasty. I don't want to smell it.
Right.
How does that differ?
Well, in my experience, so like we said, there's a chemical reaction
Right.
that takes place, and that chemical drive can weaken over time. So it can dissipate. So there's not that pull necessarily to drinking alcohol, excuse me. But at the same time, should they start again, that chemical reaction will fire up again. So that's kind of a yes and no answer. Like, yes, that chemical drive goes away, but no, and that it can come back real easily as well.
I got you. Okay, so I'm going to get to forgiveness now.
Okay.
So how did you come up with the forgiveness piece and integrating, because forgiveness is a really powerful concept.
Right.
And I wonder if there was some spiritual precursor for you to linking forgiveness into your practice, into your studies as well.
Well,
First, what is forgiveness?
Well, there's Ev Worthington, who I worked with at Virginia Commonwealth University, liked to say that if you took 4 forgiveness researchers and put them in a room and asked them to come up with a definition,
forget it.
But
Okay.
I go with it's an emotion-focused coping strategy. Some people will say it's a cognitive, some people will say it's social, but I say it's more of an emotional piece.
Oh.
And that is when I'm unforgiving towards someone, if they've wronged me somehow, when I'm angry, I feel bitter, I feel resentful, I feel vengeful, I feel those kinds of things. And those have, well-documented negative health and physical and mental
Sure.
health effects. So forgiveness then allows us, or at least attempts, to replace those negative emotions with positive other-oriented emotions like empathy or sympathy, maybe love or compassion as they are appropriate.
Okay. So it's more than letting go.
It is, yes. It's much more than just letting go. Though letting go is a way to deal with a wrong as well.
Right.
It's not forgiveness.
Okay.
And that's a mistake. A lot of people that I worked with wanted to make. Why can't I just forgive and forget? Well, forgiveness is not forgetting. It's just letting go of those negative, toxic feelings that you have.
I guess in some ways, forgiveness, you have to super remember.
Yes. Actually, the model I use, we call the REACH model. So, and the first part of that, so it's REACH, and the first part of that is recalling the hurt. And it's really important, maybe, I don't know if it's the most important part, but
Sure.
When recalling a hurt, it's important to do it in great detail. To really know what you felt, what you thought, what was happening at the time, because all those pieces feed into your unforgiveness.
So almost reliving it.
Right. It's right. And people who are unforgiving do relive it a lot. They think about it over and over. They really ruminate about what happened to them. They go about their days and they think, that was so unfair. I'm going to get that guy.
Yeah,
I can't believe he did that to
yeah.
me. Those kinds of things. So they are reliving it. So that's not really that big of a stretch. But what's difficult for them is as more time goes on, they're just angrier about it.
Right.
So it's harder to really think about what happened in the moment.
Right. So they're reliving it in a negative way. They're constantly just
Exactly.
reliving it for the
Right.
sake of reliving it.
Right.
Okay, so the E. What's the E?
So E is empathizing. And that's probably the most important step if the recalling isn't. And that is understanding that, well, everybody makes mistakes, right? I've made mistakes, you've made mistakes, everyone's made mistakes. Everyone's needed to be forgiven for something. And, I know when I've received forgiveness in the past, I've been really grateful for it. And I will need again to receive in the future. People are going to be upset with me about something or other, at some point. So a big piece of that is realizing that even though I'm angry at this person, other people have been angry at me. And it's been, it's designed to help me to understand that maybe they weren't out to get me, or
Right.
maybe
You put it in its proper context.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So what's the A?
So A then is altruistic gift, right? So offering it's actually, I suppose, is giving up the resentment, giving up the anger, and working towards replacing it with softer, more positive emotions.
Okay.
And if we can get past the E, which is really the empathizing with someone, offering that gift, that forgiveness
is easier.
Is much easier.
Yeah.
Right?
So then the C.
So the C and the H are kind of the similar. It's committing to forgiveness and holding on to it. And it's basically the idea that just because I've forgiven today, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to remember in the future what's happened. And again, feel those negative emotions. That's okay. That's human. That's going to happen.
And are these the steps that you created to take your abusers through so that they somehow could heal past the hurt?
Well, so the REACH model was Ev Worthington's from Virginia Conwell. So I worked with him and I adapted it into a self-forgiveness intervention, which is the same steps, but instead of there being negative emotions towards someone else, anger, resentment, bitterness, there's negative emotions towards the self, or for using alcohol or what have you. And those are always, well, not always, but usually shame and guilt.
Okay.
And the difference between those two, of course, is guilt is when I feel guilty, it's because I did a bad thing.
Right.
And when I feel shame, it's because I am a bad person. And the difference is, small, but really important.
Meaningful. It is. And so how does the model that you have play out with the addiction? Because what we know about forgiveness is it is a really powerful tool.
Right.
And you make a distinction between forgiving of self and forgiving of others.
Right.
So how does that distinction help the addicts move in the right direction toward healing?
Well, and that's a good question, and it's really the cornerstone of the intervention, because forgiving is a coping strategy. If you can imagine that there's a cycle of use, something happens that I have to cope with, or something happens, I need to cope with it. I drink, I do things while I'm drunk, and then, something happens again, I have to cope with it, and it kind of makes this circle.
Can you forgive while you're drunk?
I don't know that I would ever try with someone who is under the influence to get them to walk through, the steps.
Right.
But they have to be.
So they have to come in sober.
Yes.
I mean, theoretically, right?
Right.
They have to come in sober.
Right.
In order to get help.
Yeah.
Because it probably doesn't work while you're under the influence, or maybe.
Right. Well, I suppose it might. I've never gotten it to work under the influence.
Under the influence. Okay.
But to be fair, I generally, if people do come to me, and when I was working with them under the influence, I would say,
we'll work when you're sober.
Right.
So there's a religious concept, right, of forgiveness.
Right.
And there's a secular concept of forgiveness, and they may be related or maybe not. So can you make a distinction for our audience what you use? Because in my mind, forgiveness from a spiritual sort of religious context has to be about the words. You have to say, I forgive you, or God is going to get you. But that doesn't always translate into letting go and reliving and releasing and replacing the emotion.
Right.
So talk about your ideas about what the difference is. Are they the same?
Well,
Are they?
They're so similar that I don't know that, much of a distinction really can be made.
Right.
Forgiveness in and of itself is not really a religious concept, strictly speaking. It's found in all major religions. It's plays a big part in all major religions, but it also plays a big part in what people generally consider just to be healthy, behavior, like not arguing and trying to get along with your people.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I always approach forgiveness from that secular tradition.
I got you.
Now, if somebody is particularly religious, however, that's just a plus, because it's a big piece of forgiveness is being able to let go of the burden of having to seek revenge or having to seek
and at least you don't have to sell it. Right? Because they get, this is what I should do. I'm not quite sure how to get there, but I get that this is something that I should do. Is it ever inappropriate not to forgive? Like, can somebody do something so completely hideous that you're just like, forget about it, I'm not forgiven, and I don't have to because I get a pass on this one?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Okay, so so here we start talking about the distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. Okay, a lot of people think if I forgive someone, I have to reconcile with them. I have to work with them again. I have to be around them and things like that. But that's not the case. Forgiveness simply means that I wouldn't hold negative, other-oriented emotions towards that person. I don't hate them. I don't seek vengeance. I don't try to get them somehow. But that doesn't mean that I have to repair the relationship.
So that also means, right, that you can forgive someone who you never see again? Because forgiveness is really about us.
That's right.
And not about making sure the person knows. Like, if I can't reach them, I can't somehow forgive because I can't call them to say, will you please accept my apology?
That's right.
That's not what forgiveness is.
That's right.
Right. So
That's right.
Also, can we forgive people who are dead?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a big part.
It's a lot of work.
It is.
Right?
It is, because often when we try to forgive someone who has died, there's also the piece of, like, people tend to feel guilty for feeling unforgiveness towards them, or shameful. You know, like, well, I should have let this go. Why haven't I let this go? What kind of person hates someone who's died, and things like that. And also, of course, the forgiveness process can be helped if the person who did the offense does some kind of act of contrition. If they try to make it up to you, something like that, then it's easier to do. But if they've died, of course, then they can't
make it up.
They can't make it up, right?
Right. So then how do you move the addicts, right? We want to get them we've got the REACH model, we basically have convinced them, or they come in with the spiritual idea of what forgiveness is. Mm-hmm. Does it work? Does that model really work to heal addicts?
Well, in the studies that we conducted, what we found was, so we had two groups of people. The first group just went through the treatment as usual, and the second group went through the treatment
as usual. What's that? What's treatment as usual?
Standard addictions treatment, 12 steps, what have you.
Okay.
So they went through the 12-step program, or they went through the 12-step program and they had this forgiveness intervention. Okay, so it's two pieces, normal treatment and the forgiveness component. Mm-hmm. And what we found is people who had the addition of the forgiveness component at the end reported higher levels of self-forgiveness, which made sense, lower levels of shame, about comparable levels of guilt, so it didn't have much of an impact there. And I can talk about that in a second too. And most importantly, they had higher what we call drinking refusal efficacy, which is if they find themselves in a place where there's a chance they might drink, how likely are they to turn away that drink? And people in the forgiveness group ranked significantly higher on that measurement, so they were more likely to refuse drinks that were offered to them.
Wow. So talk about the guilt then. Why do you think guilt was not affected?
So guilt and shame. So shame is very detrimental. It can really be harmful. If somebody feels like they're a bad person, then they have terrible self-esteem, they're depressed, and all these kinds of things. Guilt, however, that's not necessarily true. Like, I can feel like I'm a great person, but still feel that I'm guilty for something I've done.
I gotcha.
And in that way, guilt can have a lot of pro-social motivations. Like, if I have wronged you somehow, for instance, and I feel guilty, I'm more likely to do something to make it up to you, and to apologize, to to whatever. So in that respect, a little amount of guilt is a healthy thing.
I gotcha. So would you say, based on the research that you've done, that dealing with forgiveness is pretty much the way to go, the only way to really achieve healing, some level of forgiveness, or do you believe that you stay stuck if you don't forgive? Can you move?
You can move. Forgiveness is just one of several ways of dealing with a wrong. I happen to believe, probably because it's my research, that's one of the best ways to deal with a wrong. But of course, there are some that believe, just forget what happened, move on, accept it. Those kinds of things are also ways of dealing with wrongs. There are other positive ways of dealing with wrongs, and those work for some people, and for some people they don't. There's of course also negative ways of dealing with it that still move you beyond the event, but kind of mire you in that hateful revenge cycle.
Does that keep you in that space though? How can you?
Well, let's take revenge, for example. Okay, if someone wrongs me and I just can't forgive and I seek revenge, okay, that's moving on if I exact my revenge. Okay, if I do something, then I feel like, well, this is done. I've dealt with it. Of course, that makes this nasty cycle, because then if I seek revenge and the person's like, I can't believe he attacked me, and then they seek revenge, and it kind of mires you in that way. But I have moved on from the initial event in a way.
I got you. Okay. Well, that's really, really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. Any parting thoughts that you have about what I guess any of us can do if we find ourselves in a situation where we need to forgive? Any maybe a simple practice in the last minute that we can do?
The empathizing, I think, is always the most important piece.
Remember that we were there.
Right, exactly. It's real easy to get caught up in the, I can't believe they did that to me. But then try to, and it's not easy to do, but it's a little bit of an exercise that people can work on their own, is to try to put themselves in the shoes of the offender, the person who wronged them. I'm sure they'll find 9 times out of 10 people don't mean to wrong each other.
Right, you don't get up thinking I'm going to wrong.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. It's just things happen in life, and those happen. So if people can come around to thinking that, to understanding that, then that goes a long way to help them forgive.
Or as Grandma said, when one finger's pointing at you, 4 pointing at them, 4 pointing back at you.
That's right.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Dr. Michael Scherer for being my guest. If you would like more information about the topics we discuss or Dr. Scherer's research, you may contact him at 443-287-8271 or email him at mscherer@jhsph.edu. I'm Dr. Cislina Grosser Ledbetter. Thank you for watching.